Welcome to Still Unbelievable. This is Matthew, and in this episode I'll be hosting a conversation between two returning guests. If you're a subscriber, you will no doubt have already heard the conversation Andrew and I had with Jonathan McLatchie in episode 25. If you have not heard that episode, it may be helpful to also listen to that episode, as there are several references to things that are said in episode 25. Jonathan contributes to several apologetics websites, as well as engaging in the types of dialogue that you're about to hear. He holds a bachelor's degree in forensic biology, master's degrees in evolutionary biology, as well as medical and molecular bioscience, and a PhD in evolutionary biology. He is the founder of the Apologetics Academy and assistant professor of biology at Sattler College. For this episode, Jonathan will be engaging with Blais, who Andrew and I hosted in episode 13 talking about Christian apologetics, and also on our Proscenium podcast talking with Philip Goff on panpsychism. Brian is a professor of science and technology at Bryant University and a research professor at the Institute for Brain and Neurosystems, Brown University. Before we get into the conversation, there are a few references made to studies and articles. I have put links to those in the notes. I want to draw attention specifically to two studies that Jonathan mentions about people recovering from prayer. If any listeners feels qualified to comment on the contents of those, I would genuinely appreciate any thoughts you have. Please send your comments to reasonpress@gmail.com. And finally, we suffered a few audio artifacts due to fluctuating internet quality. I have done my best to remove the worst ones, but a side effect of that is a noticeable change in voice mid-sentence on a few occasions, where I've had to cut poor audio. If you do notice these moments, I apologise and hope you understand the reasons why they're there. Now, on to the show. Welcome, Brian and Jonathan. Thank you so much for both agreeing to come back on again. Jonathan, you had a chat with us only a few weeks ago, actually, a couple of episodes ago for us, because we contacted you regarding your conversation on the Unbelievable podcast, and you had a conversation with Andrew and myself talking about the reasons for accepting the resurrection as an historical event. And Brian, we've had you on before. We had a fabulous conversation with you with Philip Goff. His book is right here next to me, talking about that, and that was a fun conversation. Philip enjoyed it, and I think you two have continued some conversations on Twitter again soon. And then Andrew forced my hand somewhat by name dropping you in the conversation that we had with Jonathan couple of weeks ago, and you were very keen to come back on, and you had some questions that you wanted to put forward after listening to the conversation that we had with Jonathan. So I'll let you start off by giving your thoughts and a couple of questions to Jonathan, and we'll see where the conversation goes from that. And if all goes well, listeners, you won't hear me again until the end, but we'll see if I do need to step in. You're both fabulous gentlemen, so I don't think there'll need to be any timeouts called, but over to you, Brian, give it a go.
All right, thank you very much, Matthew. It's nice meeting you, Jonathan. I mean, I've seen you on YouTube and that sort of thing, but this is our first time. I mean, again, somewhat virtually, but that's still very nice to meet you.
Likewise.
So I was name dropped in that episode as someone who's kind of been on this, and I think it's because we have similar interests. I mean, interest in kind of probability theory, interest in claims, religious claims specifically, and so on. And so there was a fair number of topics that were kind of overlapped our interest. So I did want to start off by perhaps suggesting some things that we might already agree on, and because they're both coming from thinking about things probabilistically. And one thing you had said in the previous episode was that any non-zero prior can, with the right amount of evidence, give you kind of confidence that particular claim is true. And I think we'd both be in agreement to that. Is that
exactly
correct?
Yeah.
And that's kind of as the same kind of thing. Probabilities of 0 and probabilities of 1 are just the logical impossibility or certainty of a particular claim. And so I think we're coming at probability, kind of the interpretation of it, the same way. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a prior probability of 0 would mean something like a married bachelor or a square circle, something that's logically impossible. And a prior probability of 1 would mean that the laws of logic or mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4 and things of that nature. And then everything else is in between those extremes somewhat.
Right. So I like to think of it, as others as, probability is kind of the generalization of logic to those cases where you have some uncertainty and in those limits. And then I've also, this is a little bit more philosophical, but perhaps we'd agree with this statement about how, essentially Bayes' rule, Bayes' theorem, it gives us kind of the structure for rational thinking, or rather from updating beliefs. And would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would.
Okay, well, so that's actually a pretty good starting point, because then what it does is it kind of opens up all kind of claims to this kind of probabilistic perspective. And the way, at least I like to think of it, is that even if you're not doing mathematics, so some people perhaps want to attach numbers to certain events, like in history, attach probabilistic numbers. But even if you don't do the mathematics, I find that Bayes' theorem and probability theory provides a good structure for how we should think about things rationally. Where can we go wrong? What kind of cognitive biases we might have? How can we avoid those, and so on? Would that be?
Exactly. I view Bayes' theorem as a way of modeling one's reasoning through problems. So you can determine, okay, so if you plug these particular values in, what is the level of confidence that's warranted by the evidence? And then it allows you to make the assumptions of your analysis explicit, so that someone else can say, well, I disagree with the numbers that you've input to your equations, and therefore my confidence is going to be different from yours.
Right. Actually, I'd even go a little bit further than that and say that it's not just provides the kind of explicit numbers that one can criticize, but which terms you would include and how they would relate. And so I think, again, it's providing the structure for your argument and making everything explicit. I think that's actually a major benefit to thinking in this way, is it kind of forces out all your assumptions.
Right. Yeah, and I prefer using this sort of inductive approach to a more deductive approach to, a lot of physics, especially those that adhere to the class. So I think that I prefer to use a more inductive approach to a deductive approach. A deductive approach is where you set out your premises and then the conclusion necessarily follows given a rule of inference.
Right.
And if the premises are true, then the conclusion cannot be false. It has to be true mathematically. Right. And I prefer a more inductive approach because, of course, the conclusion is only ever as sure as your premises. So if your two premises are each have a probability, for instance, of 0.6, well, then your conclusion is going to have a probability of 0.36. So I prefer to model the argument inductively and probabilistically so as to make the uncertainty of the premises explicit. Right.
And I would say, all of science is inductive. I like to tell my students that that the word proof doesn't exist in science. You only have evidence and you have probabilities, because you never are 100% certain of anything, and one can everything really should be probabilistic. So that's good. I'm not a big fan of deductive arguments in these cases either. So given that, you can go in a number of different directions. I had just a few questions specifically about things you said in the previous episode, and maybe we can start there and then just take it wherever you or I we want to go. A lot of the discussion, because it was about the resurrection, came down to talking about miracles. And you brought up Keener's book of miracle claims, and said that it somehow undermines the naturalistic perspective that miracles can't happen or haven't happened. And I didn't really understand that. And this is kind of part of a broader discussion of kind of miracles in general, but that was something that I wasn't sure what you meant by that.
Sure. So
did I get that quote right? And then
yeah. So the reason I brought up Keener's 2-volume set on miracles was in relation to David Hume argument that the uniform human experience precludes miracles. In fact, let me just read the back of the book on miracles. He says, this is what he writes. He says, most modern prejudice against biblical miracle reports depends on David Hume's argument that uniform human experience precludes miracles. Yet current research shows that human experience is far from uniform. In fact, hundreds of millions of people today claim to have experienced miracles. New Testament scholar Craig Keener argues that it is time to rethink Hume's argument in light of the contemporary evidence available to us. And so essentially it is only an objection to the claim of David Hume that uniform human experience precludes miracles, and so you could never infer a miracle claim to be probable because it lies outside the realm of human experience. And the only point that I wish to draw from that is that human experience in that regard is not uniform. There are many people that do claim to have witnessed miracles, and so it's very hard to say that it lies outside the realm of human experience. And David Hume's argument, I think, is circular in the sense that he has to assume that all of these hundreds of miracle claims and miracle reports are false, which is the very point that he's trying to establish with his argument. And so it runs in a circle.
Okay, so I've always read Hume, and I think one of the problems that I think Hume has is that he predates a mature theory of probability. I mean, so many of the things that he says is just an inch close to kind of a probabilistic description of things. So most of what Hume said about miracles seemed to be in the kind of contrasting testimony versus an actual miracle. And he would say things about how it would have to be less probable for the person to be, incorrect than the probability for the miracle itself. So in that case, you could think of Hume's statement that miracles are outside of human experience or uniform human experience as you could think of it as a claim, right? So essentially in his day there were many miracle claims, and it can be easily shown that it was far more likely that people were mistaken in some way than the miracle itself. And I don't see it as circular as being inductive. So essentially said, okay, it seems as if miracles are beyond uniform human experience. Miracle claims, of course, are part of human experience. So many people will claim that. And we could disprove this by basically demonstrating the veracity of a single miracle claim. And if you treat that as essentially a prediction, then you would see that there hasn't been a verified miracle claim even since Hume's time, and that it would make his claim actually stronger probabilistically. So that's at least the way that I have always read Hume, is essentially just shy of probability theory. His wording is a little bit less specific than I would like in certain places, but he's clarified with essentially a few more decades of math. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the issue is that it doesn't seem that miracles are outside of human experience if there's hundreds of miracle claims. And I'm not vouching necessarily for the veracity of all those miracle claims. I'm just saying it's very difficult to establish that they lie outside of human experience if there are all these miracle claims from around the world.
Well, actually, I think there are two different things, right? So you, in fact, have to make the stance that at least one of them is true to hold the idea that it is not outside of uniform human experience, if we're reading it that way. Essentially, Hume is saying, and or perhaps we can bring it more modern, like I'm saying, like miracles don't seem to happen, but we have lots of miracle claims. And so given that, it seems that it's far more likely that people are mistaken. And so I don't see that as a direct conflict. I see it more as almost like a prediction. And it would be totally disproven if someone would be able to demonstrate the veracity of even a single miracle claim, which, as far as I can tell, hasn't happened.
So when you say that miracles don't seem to happen, what's your basis for saying that?
I have never seen anyone convinced of a miracle in any kind of controlled setting. I mean, essentially, I've heard many people say things like, prayer works, and then you do prayer studies and it doesn't, the effect seems to disappear. I've heard of many people who have said faith healings work, and then when you try to investigate it, you either find that the data is completely unavailable, in which case it's just inscrutable, or can show that a mundane explanation is far more likely. And this happens in every case that I've ever investigated, and it's happened, as far as I can tell, in every case that I have seen anyone honestly investigate it as well. And so and this actually somewhat brings, because we can cast a slightly wider net here, because it brings in another question, because at this point I would often try to rely on other analogies, because you're convinced perhaps that miracles happen, but if you cast a wider net in terms of claims of rare events, I think we can find some common ground in terms of the way we approach things. When I brought up some of these analogies, they don't seem to stick with theists very much, and I'm kind of curious why that is. So, for example, the same type of argument can be made for alien abductions or UFOs as alien spacecraft sightings, and things like the healings of other people like Satya Sai Baba and the miracle claims around there, which was mentioned in the previous episode. But specifically things like aliens and UFOs, like the same structure seems to apply. Rare extreme events, many different people claiming it, globally over time, similar lack of evidence. You probably don't find that analogy compelling.
No.
Okay.
But let's go to the question of whether there are any peer-reviewed papers in the research literature on miracles. So For instance, are you familiar with the recent paper published in April 2019 in the journal Complementary Therapies in Medicine? And I can send you the paper later if you want, but the title is Case Report of Gastroparesis Healing, 16 Years of a Chronic Syndrome Resolved After Proximal Intercessory Prayer. Essentially, the case is about a 23-year-old white male who experienced intermittent cramping and projectile vomiting at 1 week of age. And he was diagnosed with gastroparesis, which is a chronic lifelong condition that known to significantly impact the quality and length of life. And there was the maximal medical treatment was given to this individual, but it failed to be effective. And for the next 16 years, his symptoms remained severe, and he was dependent on a feeding tube. Mm-hmm. And then in November 2011, he experienced what the journal article calls proximal intercessory prayer, or PIP, from an evangelist who reported his own story of having his life spared when his intestines were severed in a car accident. And halfway through the prayer, the boy describes experiencing a shock throughout his body, and mm-hmm. after the prayer, the boy ate a meal without any complications. And according to the paper, this kind of sudden, lasting recovery from gastroparesis is unique in the scholarly literature. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of a peer-reviewed study on the efficacy of a prayer, is it not?
It could be. Again, I'm familiar with that particular study. One of the problems is it's a kind of a one-off in that way, which of course makes it a little harder to investigate. And I've heard of other similar ones that when you look at the details, they don't quite line up in the way that the initial report would state. I'm definitely very curious in looking at this, because this is the sort of thing that when people make a claim and there's some evidence for it, then there's the chance for trying to track it down. And just a quick Google search of this seems to, most of the sites, for I think obvious reasons, are religious sites that seem to be citing it. So it is going to take a little bit of digging to sort that one out. But there are other prayer studies that are a little bit more systematic across, with, controlled cases, because, a single case, that can happen for many different reasons. One is just, medical conditions tend to have these, peculiar random effects, basically remissions and things like that. And there may be unique events in those cases. The other thing that can happen is a response, to the attention given. And that, again, requires some kind of a controlled or blinding sorts of experiments, which is why, like in science, we aren't generally convinced by these kind of one-off sorts of things. But if we're talking about kind of the alien abduction cases, we have eyewitnesses that we can interview. There have been cases where they brought forward materials. There are claims about UFOs that leave marks on the grounds and trees and things like that. Again, similar sorts of claims, different context. Doesn't seem to convince you, though. Is that correct?
Okay. You said that it was a one-off incident. I'll give you another one. This is another study from the journal Explorer, a case report. The title is Case Report of Instantaneous Resolution of Juvenile Macular Degeneration Blindness After Proximal Intercessory Prayer. And the highlights given in the article are, a young woman presented with sudden bilateral vision loss and atrophy in each fovea. She was diagnosed with juvenile macular degeneration and was blind for 12 years. After brief proximal intercessory prayer experience, she regained her eyesight, and her eyesight has remained 20/40 for over 40 years since the PIP event. So there's another example. So at what point do you say these aren't isolated studies?
I want to look at the specific cases, because I've seen similar miracle claims with similar sorts of reports that when we actually look at what happened, the case is a little more murky. The timing of the intervention is not what was implied, or the person was recovering anyway during this time, and now they're just reporting it. There's a million ways that any particular study can go wrong. And that's not true just in this case. This is pretty much true in any field. My first instinct when I read, nearly any science paper is I look at it, I'm like, okay, I'm not going to believe it until I can see, how the evidence plays out. And there are cases where I've been incorrect about that, but it's been demonstrated with the evidence. So one example
I was just going to read just quickly the patient perspective that's supplied in the paper. This is what the patient wrote concerning the experience. She said, what people need to understand is I was blind totally blind and attended the school for the blind. I read Braille and walked with a white cane. Never had I seen my husband or daughter's face. I was blind when my husband prayed for me. Then, just like that, in a moment after years of darkness, I could see perfectly. It was miraculous. My daughter's picture was on the dresser. I could see what my little girl and husband looked like. I could see the floor, the steps. Within seconds, my life had drastically changed. I could see. So
it's a great story. But again, I mean, do you think, for example, that these sorts of stories only occurring in certain religious contexts, either Christian contexts, or do you think they also apply to people who pray who are Muslims or Hindus? Do you think that these sorts of stories occur when someone is just, given some kind of treatment that has nothing to do with religion? These things may happen without any kind of attention. Do you think you could find a story like that in another context? And my guess is yes, if you look. And I mean, I haven't looked in these particular cases, but I've certainly heard about healings in other religions. I've also heard about people who have kind of miraculous recoveries from crazy illnesses that they never thought they would be cured of with no obvious, cause. And because of that, this is the kind of, again, the scientific approach is to say, look, these things can happen, under other circumstances. You also have to count, this is also like, you can easily find positive cases. How about all the cases where people prayed and nothing happened? How many of those, and then you can look at how often does it happen on its own versus how often does it happen when someone prays for them, and so on. This is the sort of thing that you would expect to see if the effect was real. You'd be able to see it on kind of a larger scale, not just this like one little thing here and one little thing there, and a lot of negative cases that are simply ignored or are never seen. I mean, people who just don't speak up because it never happens to them. And so, you can come up with anecdotes, and you can even come up with publishable anecdotes, but that doesn't mean that that's good evidence for kind of agency behind it. I guess that's the part where, and you still haven't addressed why you're not convinced by things like alien abductions and UFO sightings and experiences when, again, these are, I could probably come up with a lot of stories that are similar in this way, but I don't think that you would be convinced. Was that correct?
Right. In regards to people that pray and their prayers are not answered, I would refer to this as epistemic asymmetry. And if you listen to my debate with David Johnson recently on Unbelievable, I talk about epistemic asymmetry, which is to say that having a particular data could be strong evidence in favor of your hypothesis, whereas not having it is only negligible or weak evidence against. And so in this case, I think that fulfillments of prayer or answered prayer, it could be taken to be stronger evidence for the truth of Christianity or theism, whereas unanswered prayer would only be comparatively or relatively weaker evidence because there's no way of getting your handle on all the relevant variables. I think, for example, that sin can hinder one's prayer life. I think, and there are, obviously God has more knowledge than we have, and so we just don't have access to all the relevant variables. And so I think it's difficult to make an argument against the existence of God from unanswered prayer.
I mean, you're saying that you don't have all the relevant variables, and one of the things that you brought in was essentially what God would want to do, right? I mean, you said God's knowledge is greater, and it seems like that could work in the other direction as well, right? I mean, you don't have all the relevant variables. So again, you haven't established that these sorts of events are tied specifically to religious sorts of interventions. You haven't shown that the rate at which they happen is somehow greater than would happen just essentially randomly because we don't understand all the biology. And so it seems as if God's inscrutable, it's on both sides. And one can't just say, well, I'm just going to count the hits and ignore the misses. And because if it says in Scripture, and you know Scripture way better than I do, it's certainly implied that if you ask, you shall receive. And certainly people expect prayer to work at least more than not praying, and so that effect should be measurable, and yet it doesn't seem to be. If stories here and there, that's a problem. And again, I would reiterate the analogy with alien abductions, because we have people who've had life-altering events happen to them that they claim are aliens who came into their house and took them away for a while and brought them back. And I don't see much difference, honestly, in terms of the structure. And in fact, the the same approach that I use for evaluating miracle claims, I use for alien abduction claims. I just say, let's look, and the UFO sightings. I, find the original, look at what the evidence is. I, don't believe it until the evidence is there, and I don't see strong evidence of agency in either case.
So the question that we want to address, though, is on the hypothesis of theism, is answered prayer more probable than it would be on the hypothesis of non-theism? And is it sufficiently more improbable on theism than it would be on non-theism? And so that's a question that we can ask on a case-by-case basis. I'm inclined to say in the two examples I gave that it would be more probable given theism than given non-theism. And so therefore it could be taken as some evidence in favor of theism and of miracles relative to the annulment of that hypothesis. Is it conclusive evidence for Christianity? No, but not by any means. But I think it's at least there's some part of a cumulative evidence for Christianity.
Actually, I would disagree that it even established that it's greater, and for several reasons. Sean Carroll, in his debate with William Lane Craig, talks about how theism is not well defined, and he makes a point of that, showing how you can kind of fit almost anything with it. But if you take theism, right, you have something like the Christian God, who he might in his better moods decide to heal this person or that, but doesn't seem to. The Old Testament God seems to be a bit different. But if you then in theism, you have to include all the gods, really. And so if you have something like Loki, right, Loki is the god of chaos, and Loki would probably actively work against prayer in some way, or, make it just random enough. And so, in fact, I would say that you couldn't even tell the direction of the probability of prayer working on theism unless you're going to really narrow it down to a particular type of theism. And even there, if you're saying that God's motivations are inscrutable, he has more knowledge than you, I'm not even certain whether you could even say that the probability of prayer is even greater under theism. In some ways, it might work against you. I mean, there are some prayer studies that actually show that the person knows that they're being prayed for, that they actually have a negative medical effect rather than a positive one. So I don't see it even as necessarily contributing even to a cumulative case.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, if we could define, we could go more specific and talk about the hypothesis of Christian theism relative to the falsehood of Christian theism. And I think in that case, we could say that even if the probability is less than 50%, that God would answer a prayer, even if we make that assumption, let's say that it's 30% or whatever, for the sake of argument, I think you could still argue that the probability of that is higher on theism than it would be on the falsehood of that.
No, actually, I couldn't even do that because so let's say you're saying probability of prayer being effective on Christian theism versus non-Christian theism, right? Because then that would include all potential gods who might answer prayers just cause, right? Or whatever. I mean, again, the direction is, because it's not well defined, is just not even approachable. And that's one of the issues, I think, is that I think in some of these calculations, when you try to set up kind of Bayes' rule or whatever, and you do things with like theism versus not theism, because the terms themselves are not well defined, you can't apply probability theory to them. And this is one of the things that we can kind of point out. And I'm not sure whether you can get even that direction.
But if the prayer is directed to the God of the Bible, then the God of the Bible is the relevant deity, right?
Maybe not. I mean, again, if I throw something like Loki in there, right? Is the god of chaos. I could totally imagine, or even the Stephen Fry's evil god hypothesis, right? You could think of them going against, deliberately messing with the Christians, essentially.
Although one could argue that the prior probability of, say, Loki existing is astronomically small relative to that of the Christian god.
Why?
Well, there's no background evidence that even suggests that Loki exists.
Is there any background evidence for the other? I mean, I don't see any real difference there.
Well, I would argue that there's overwhelming evidence for Christianity being true.
Okay. So now you've had to broaden the scope of things in order to argue for these particular events. So this is. And so we'll get, actually, that might be an interesting direction to get to in a second. But I do want to point out almost a strategic point which happens. And actually, let me back up for a second. A similar point was reached in the last episode, and you brought up the idea of worldviews. And I think this might be a good time to raise that word because I don't completely understand what it was, but it was specifically at the point where they're talking about handling of evidence for mundane claims versus miracle claims. And since you just brought up the kind of idea of overwhelming evidence for God, obviously that's going to impact your belief in miracles. And I think that's where the context came in. But I was wondering what you think, what a worldview difference would be and what that really means to you.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I brought that up is it was assumed in the previous episode that the probability of the resurrection is astronomically small because there's no independent reason to think that God exists. And obviously, I think that there is overwhelming reason from the natural sciences to think that God exists. And therefore, my adjudication of the probability of a resurrection, let's say, is going to be higher than it would be if an atheist was not convinced of that independently.
I see. Yeah. Okay. So what you're talking about, but okay. So how the thing is, the worldview seems to be indicative of essentially a probabilistic argument you've made, kind of coming into the room about God when you're talking about the resurrection. So you're saying how it raises a prior probability of the resurrection, but it's really, if you think of it, as part of the data, right? So you could think of it as the posterior probability for the resurrection is what one is really interested in, and that should include all the data, including things about evidence for God and so on. We might want to, one of the things about writing out the probability math might be to explicitly make all those steps there rather than assuming any particular one. So is that what you're kind of referring to, is essentially the idea of worldview is essentially a label given to different accepted background knowledge in a probability?
Yeah, I think so. So there are entire volumes written on evidences for the existence of God, as you know. Sure. And so when writing an article on specifically the resurrection, one doesn't have time to write 500 pages arguing for God before one moves on to the resurrection, because that's been done elsewhere.
Sure. I got this sense, and maybe this is, I've heard it used before, and I wasn't sure whether you're using it in this way, where there seemed to be a difference in terms of what sorts of explanations would convince one of a miracle. And the point was being made that the kind of mundane agreements to history in the Gospels was enough to verify the kind of mundane other events in the Gospels that we might not be able to check, but wasn't enough to verify a miracle. And then I think you would label that as kind of a worldview difference because you felt that it was good evidence for a miracle. Am I getting that correct?
Well, it's an inductive argument on the basis of the numerous points of confirmation of the Gospel accounts and the Book of Acts. We can therefore trust those claims in the Gospels and Acts that we cannot directly cross-check because the documents prove themselves to be substantially trustworthy.
Right, but even, I mean, I think they contest it substantially, and I would as well. But even in that case, you would only be able to verify things of a comparable prior probability. So if we want to phrase it that way, it wasn't phrased quite that way in the episode, but I think that was what they're getting at. It was that the mundane sorts of agreements might make us more confident in some of the other kind of mundane events that happened, even though we might not have good historical, verification of those particular things. But that it would never be able to take something like walking on water, healing the sick, raising from the dead, that kind of stuff, would never be able to make those likely simply because the prior probabilities for those are much lower. And I think what you're saying is that you're coming in with some kind of background knowledge that you feel that the prior probability for the resurrection in this current calculation is much higher than other people. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that would be correct. I would think that the probability is higher than many atheists would assert because the background information concerning the existence of God, and I also think you can make a case for the theohistorical context of the life of Jesus of Nazareth, as I did in the previous episode as well, right. Which I think can be used to raise the prior probability. And also, when it comes to the Gospels and demonstrating that there are numerous points of historical corroboration, both internal to the Gospels themselves and also from external secular sources as well, I think that it shows that the Gospel accounts, and indeed the Book of Acts, are close up to the fact. They're either written by people who were eyewitnesses or people who were closely associated with eyewitnesses, and they are grounded in eyewitness testimony. And so therefore we have reason to trust that, okay, so they're close up to the facts and they're habitually truthful, and they are reporting what they believe they saw happen.
Right, but even if I grant you all that, which I wouldn't, because there's enough things that seem like contradictions, like the two nativity stories, for example, and yeah, one might be able to jump through some hoops to line those up, but they seem certainly on the face of it to be not exactly overlapping. And there's other examples like that, and the contortions one has to go through to try to figure out that the gospel writers are somehow claiming to be eyewitnesses. But even if I grant you all of that, we have cases again in the kind of alien abduction cases, Barney and Betty Hill, and there's others. That's one of the first ones where these people, there are eyewitnesses. They were interviewed by eyewitnesses. I'm not sure if they're still alive right now. I think at least one of them has died of Barney and Betty Hill, but there's obviously others and we're not convinced by them, right? So these are people who are supposedly eyewitnesses to things, or Roswell, any of those things. And we have, in at least one case, we have videotape apparently of this, but we're not convinced of these claims. And so we might be convinced that there's a Roswell in the United States, and we can find it on a map and so on. And there might be certain events that are named in the story, but we're not going to believe that alien spacecraft are housed there or that they have aliens there, right? And so in the same exact logic seems to apply modern day. I don't think you're convinced by these stories. But I don't see how that's any different.
I would need to look into those on a case-by-case basis. I'm not particularly well versed in alien abduction stories. But you would need to show that the people giving the accounts are habitually truthful, and that they're close up to the facts, or eyewitnesses themselves, and that they are substantially reliable in the reportage.
Yes, and you can actually show that in many of these cases. It is interesting the parallels in there, and so maybe it's just a matter of reading. A really good book, somewhat older, by Carl Sagan called The Demon Hunted World, goes through many cases in there and talks about this. But you brought up, for instance, Sachi Sababa, for example. Actually, I think Andrew had brought him up, and you had said that he was exposed to be a con artist, right, for his miracles. If you imagine that we had, or we can do it for the Mormons if we want to, that we have the claims of the Mormons filtered through 100 years of pro-Mormon writers, right? And pretty much anything that was anti-Mormon, or any evidence that Joseph Smith was a con man or anything else, kind of got lost to history. You could easily imagine it looking a lot like what the Gospels are presenting. And so to me, in modern context, you kind of move the evidence forward to the 1930s or something like that, and then you can say, like, would you be convinced by evidence of a book coming out today claiming about events in 1930s? I don't think you would be. And having more information doesn't actually help. So knowing that Sachi Sababa was shown to be a con man doesn't actually help, because you just don't have that information in the Gospels. And so it should make you less clear.
But I pointed out in the previous show that there's a difference between making a bit of ash appear in your hand, or making a watch materialize, which can easily be accounted for by sleight of hand, and appearing to your disciples over a period of 40 days and having breakfast with them and having group conversations with them, having physical contact with them. It seems that there's not a parallel there.
Okay, so, and here I think you're trusting again the stories, where I don't think we have. We actually have good evidence that the stories have been exaggerated over time, even in the time period of the Gospels. Paul never mentions any kind of extended visits. In fact, as far as I can tell, Paul never mentions Jesus ever walking on the earth.
Yes, it does. You're not getting that from Carrier, I hope, right?
Well, we could read in a lot of things. It was actually something else that I read. I can't remember somewhere back where the offhand comment how Paul never mentions disciples; he only mentions apostles. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting distinction. And then I went back and reread Paul and to see that. I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. And I'm not saying that I'm a mythicist, but it's at least it's one of those things where he doesn't mention things like the empty tomb. He doesn't mention guards. He doesn't mention any of the the stories, that the post-resurrection stories. Even Mark doesn't mention the guards, doesn't mention the post-resurrection stories. And we know that the other Gospels copied from Mark. And so it seems like the pattern is essentially from simple to more complicated. The same pattern exists in some of the, again, I'll bring it up, the UFO sightings. I mean, there's a case in Rendlesham Forest in England where there was, I think it's off of a U.S. Army base there, and there was a famous UFO case, and there was like an initial sighting of a light that they followed. And then later on, it seems to have gotten embellished to an alien spacecraft, and there was, evidence of scarring on trees and other things like that. And then there was a journal that was recovered. So there was this kind of legendary development that happened in a very short time. And, I'm not saying that's exactly what happened with the Gospels, but there's enough of a question that I'm not going to take any story in the Gospels as necessarily being truthful. It's so, even if they get some of the facts of places and people right, it's so easy for a story to creep in because it's a good story. The woman who was going to be stoned for adultery is a great example of that, where it doesn't seem to exist in any of the early manuscripts and seems to have been added later. I mean, it's a fantastic story, and so you can see that already. So I don't necessarily. So when you say that Jesus appeared over 40 days and had multisensory experiences, with the apostles, where kind of smells and touches, and they can eat with them and everything else. I see that as, well, you know what, that could have easily been a story, and that's far more likely than a miracle. Right, and this is, again, the probability. Even if I'm not doing the math, it's and I think this was Hume's point, was that we have stories, we have testimony. Testimony being wrong is much more likely than a miracle, and it should be that straightforward. And it seems to be that straightforward when you bring it forward to modern day. Any modern day example seems to have that same structure.
Yeah, so I have a few comments on what you just said. So, first point, you said that Paul doesn't say anything about Jesus walking on the earth. That's just simply false. I can give numerous examples. Romans 1:3 says he was born of the seed of David. Galatians 4:4 says he was born of a woman born under the law. Right. 1 Timothy 6:13 says that he stood before Pontius Pilate.
Okay, well, Timothy is a questionable document anyway, right? I mean, it's not one of. I mean, it's not. I mean, again, I'm not a biblical scholar. If we go by the consensus, I think that Timothy is not in the list of the canonical Pauline letters.
And I would disagree with that.
Sure, and you would know a lot more. But even those, I've heard those other two examples. They're not particularly convincing. I mean, it's like someone who was born of a woman, and so it's not exactly a revelation here for the most part, but
he would walked upon the earth, which was what you were.
Actually, in a sense, it doesn't. Honestly, what I mean is that, like, is there anything that talks about him having a ministry with followers? For example, is there anything that talks about? I mean, even
actually. So in 1 Corinthians 15 verse 5, it mentions that it mentions the 12.
Sure. To say that they were followers of him,
which is consistent with that. I mean, it is. I mean, and furthermore, I mean, you've got the Book of Acts, which clearly alludes to the 12 and being apostles, and Luke was a traveling companion of Paul, and so if it seems very surprising that Paul's own traveling companion believed in 12 disciples, and Paul himself mentions the 12. It'd be very strange if they had different understandings of what the 12 actually were.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, I don't know Acts quite as well as I know the Gospels and some of the letters, but from what I've read, there are disagreements between the story of Paul's conversion in Acts and the ones that Paul himself gives.
So I would disagree with that. Give me an example.
And again, I would have to find the actual quotes. I'm not as well versed or have the memory for such things quite as much. But the point is that we still are left with stories and testimony, and that's never enough to verify something miraculous. We've never, even something like, I think I asked a question about what would it take in text from, say, greater than 500 years ago, so just rather than modern text, what would it take to convince you of the efficacy of some medical claim, like some medical treatment or whatever? Would you be able to confidently believe that a particular medical claim is true based only on historical writings? And I don't think that would. I'm not sure that there would be anything that would ever convince myself, just because the type of data you have in history doesn't lend itself well to that. I mean, you can think of what would convince us now, and things like controlled studies and so on. We don't take anecdotes because we know that those can be false. We have, placebo effects to deal with, and so on and so on. We simply don't have that sort of structure in history. It should limit our ability to understand certain types of claims, and I would include miracle claims in that category, because we wouldn't be able to control for bias, any other type of mistake that could happen, that could creep in.
Well, the point is though that we have 4 contending hypotheses, which I think are mutually exhaustive in regards to the resurrection. As I mentioned last time I was on the show, which are that the apostles didn't in fact claim he rose again. It's later myth, or that they deliberately lied about it, or they were honest mistaken about it, or Jesus really did rise from the dead. And I think all explanations of the resurrection evidence fall into one of those categories.
It could be more than one. I mean, for
exactly.
example, could it be that Peter lied and convinced everyone else, or Peter and Paul lied and convinced everyone, or maybe Peter and Paul were the only ones who had any kind of experience. They were mistaken, but they convinced everyone else. Very much like, you were convinced by the people who taught you, right? You probably don't claim to have had a first-hand experience of the risen Jesus walking around in your house. Is that?
You're right.
You've never. Yeah. Right, and so you've had to accept the word of others and evidence from others as well, and so you could imagine maybe it's one or two or whatever. That's possible. So I don't think those categories necessarily are quite as sharp as you might think. Is that okay? And then I'd also say that probably the mistaken part kind of lumps in a whole bunch of things that might be useful to kind of pick apart, because you could have something that's like hallucination followed by legendary development, right? So it's kind of a combination of these things.
Yeah, you're right that the explanation for the relevant evidence could be one of those hypotheses or a combination thereof. No, we're on the same page there. But
the other thing is the resurrection, saying the resurrection happened, right? You're saying the resurrection happened exactly as stated. It's possible that you could have had some kind of alien technology resurrected this guy, but he didn't have the perfect body as stated in the kind of theological text, but that was later added essentially as kind of their interpretation of this fantastic event. I mean, there's other kind of even there may be other complexities or nuances even in that group.
Although I would suggest that the probability of the alien technology hypothesis is much lower. But
why is that?
Well, what motivation would they have for raising Jesus of Nazareth from the dead?
Well, it's hard to know what the motivation God has, right? You've actually said that already, and we could.
No, but I think we can establish that God plausibly has motivation for raising Jesus from the dead, from the argument from predictive prophecy, especially concerning the Messiah, the theohistorical context, which I talked about last time, etc.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether. I mean, again, I don't think everything is quite as crystal clear on there, and certainly people didn't really know what his kind of motivations might be. And just because I don't know the motivations of the aliens, at least I know that aliens can exist, potentially, and that technology can exist, and we have some technology that might come somewhat close to what this is, although obviously not near enough. So at least I have a mechanism that is, at least somewhat plausible. We have no such mechanism in the case of, God doing it. So there, I think one could seriously argue about the prior probabilities, given that situation.
Why does God have to have a physical mechanism?
Okay. So now we have he doesn't. Of course he could, right? I mean, maybe. So the next question is there any evidence that the term supernatural even has any content? So I think you had said that no one is claiming that Jesus rose from the dead from natural means, that is some supernatural means. And I'm not sure what that term really means, honestly, whether it really has any content beyond just saying magic did it. And so, I don't know. I mean, it's not really a mechanism. It's just a kind of maybe a label for I don't know.
But, I mean, if we have independent reason to think that God exists, which we don't have in the case of aliens, extraterrestrial life, and we are also to have independent evidence for Jesus being the culmination and climax of the Hebrew Bible, and also the theohistorical context, Jesus' death coinciding with the Feast of Passover, etc. And the other instances of messianic convergence I mentioned last time, which I actually sent you one of my article where I discussed that as well.
Right.
And that seems to me to raise the proper probability. And we don't have any independent evidence for the existence of aliens, or certainly not technologically advanced aliens. And it's also very far-fetched that they would even be able to make contact with the Earth, given the vastness of the universe.
I grant you that, for sure. And the fact that aliens would have a tough time getting here from an energy point of view is certainly problematic. But we do have many people claiming that aliens are here, and much like we have many people claiming that God is acting. So, we could probably consider that to be independent evidence that they're actually here on the kind of the same level. I am not at all convinced by any of the messianic prophecies or any of that, especially the part about Passover, simply because the writers of the Gospels already knew the stories, and it was just very easy for them to include. There's good story reasons for having it be on Passover, and to me that is far more likely than this compounding of miracles that seems to have to line up in order to give you evidence to have the resurrection. And just because it is a compelling story, and I think that perhaps is one of the reasons for its success is that very reason that it is kind of a compelling story in that way. Now, I've been talking for about an hour here. And I probably should let you ask me questions if you want to, and take the dialogue a little bit if that's okay. I don't want to be the one kind of dominating everything in the conversation.
Can I just jump in before that happens?
Sure, Matt.
Please. Listening to you talking, Brian, I'm sure listeners come up with this thought. There seems to be a bit of a sense of and forgive me if this comes across unkind, so I'm going to state it as blunt as I possibly can. There seems to be a sense of anything that comes under the category of personal testimony is almost automatically rejected. Is that a fair assessment of kind of where you're coming from? And if I'm being overly broad, correct me where I am.
So I would say that, and I think you brought this up in the last one about it depends on the claim, right? It depends on the prior. So I'm okay taking someone's testimony about what car they own or what pets they've had. I'll even take testimony of even extreme events as long as it's backed up by a reasonable amount of evidence. I mean, that's why we have things like peer review and so on. So, but the more rare the event, the less I'm going to take someone's word for it. And I think most people think that way also. It's like if you go and buy a used car, if someone, if the salesman is making a lot of extraordinary claims, you're probably not going to believe them as much as relatively mundane claims. And you're just not going to simply take their word for it. And I think a lot of the processes in science have been established specifically because we recognize that testimony itself is unreliable, and there's a whole host of cognitive biases that we all have, and that's why you do blind studies, that's why you have peer review, that's why skepticism exists, is because we recognize these failures in all of us, and it's easiest to fool. I think Richard Feynman said that the easiest person to fool is yourself, and so you want to take steps to kind of avoid that. Does that answer your question, Matthew?
Yes, it does. Thanks, Brian.
You mentioned that you don't find the argument for messianic convergence convincing because the evangelists knew their Old Testament, and so they basically tried to comport the telling of the Jesus story with the Old Testament scripture. What did you think of the arguments I actually provided in the article for trusting those relevant details as to their historical veracity? So I gave the example, for instance, of Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem 6 days before, triumphal entry into Jerusalem 5 days before Passover, having arrived at Bethany the night before, 6 days before Passover. And I showed, by comparison with Mark, that indeed that historical detail is correct, which is part of the evidence for Jesus' death itself being at the time of Passover. And but also,
how is that not, possibly Mark saying, "Oh, look, I need to have," the story is Jesus is killed on Passover, or I think in Gospel of John it might be one day before. So there's some disagreement about the time exactly, but it kind of makes sense that he would come in around that time, right? So to me, it seems like that's a story, and that's part of the story. It's kind of like I think it's Robert Price who brings up the idea, it's like questioning the Emerald City and say, well, if the Emerald City didn't exist, where does the Yellow Brick Road go to, right? And it's like, well, it's all part of the story, so that's why it's just not particularly convincing to me.
Yeah, I don't grant there's a contradiction between the synoptics and John. In fact, that's what I call a reconcilable variation, which actually points to independence, and I think that they're quite readily harmonizable. But on the point of Jesus' triumphal entry happening 5 days before Passover, I actually supplied a historical argument for trusting that particular detail. And that is, if you look at John 12, verse 1 and 2, it says, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus therefore went to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And then the following day, verse 12 says, the next day, the large crowd that had come to the feast heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, and so they took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him, crying out, Hosanna, etc. And so John gives us this very specific extraneous detail, which is not given to us by any of the other Gospels, that Jesus arrived at Bethany 6 days before Passover, and then the following day he rides into Jerusalem on the back of a donkey, which would have been 5 days before Passover. When we go over to Mark's Gospel, chapter 11, it says in verse 1, now when they drew near to Jerusalem, Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the village in front of you, and immediately as you enter, you'll find a colt tied, at which no one has ever sat, untied, and bring it. And so Mark seems to telescope the narrative in contrast to John. He doesn't mention that actually Jesus arrived the night before, and in the morning he sends the disciples to get the colt. However, when you get to verse 11, it says, and he entered Jerusalem, went to the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. If John is correct, bear in mind, Mark hasn't told us exactly the timestamp that John gives us, but if John is correct, then verse 11 is the evening of 5 days before Passover. And then you've got verse 12 to 14, which narrate the cursing of the fig tree, and according to verse 12, it happened the following day, which is 4 days before the Passover, assuming, again, the chronology of John. And then you get to verse 19, and it says, when evening came, they went out of the city. And then you've got, in verse 20, it says, as they passed by in the morning, so the fig tree withered away to its roots. So verse 19 would be the evening of 4 days before Passover. And verse 20 would be the morning of 3 days before Passover. And then you get the Olivet Discourse, where you have Jesus having a conversation with his disciples on the Mount of Olives, which is midway between Jerusalem, where he's been all day, and Bethany, where his accommodation is for the night. And so we can assume, I think fairly, that this is the evening of 3 days before Passover. And you turn over to chapter 14, verse 1, it says it was now 2 days before the Passover, synchronizing exactly as you would expect, given the chronology of John. And that's part of the evidence. There's other evidence as well that supports that, in fact, Jesus' death does happen around the time of Passover.
I just have a few questions here. Is it possible that John had a copy of Mark with him?
Yes.
When he? Okay. So is there any reason that we would be surprised if they didn't have kind of a roughly overlapping timeline? I mean, it seems to me that this is arguing that the story must be correct because this other story that someone wrote is consistent on these, this timeline, for example, of a few days, but that second writer had the first writer's book in front of him. Yeah, why is that at all surprising, and how does that possibly get us even remotely close to the idea that the physical laws of the universe had to be suspended in order to have certain events happen? To me, those are on such different scales of evidence. Does that make sense?
The point isn't so much the consistency, but the subtlety and the casualness of the consistency. That's why it's called an undesigned coincidence.
Sure, but if they had, I mean, the thing is, these can happen accidentally if they happen to have the same sources and they're summarizing. They're going to drop out some details versus others, but they're going to keep the overall timeline. Let's imagine they were writing in perfect lockstep. They knew where Jesus was on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. They've summarized because they have paper limits because paper's expensive and they want to make sure they get all the story in. These things are, I don't know, they're just not surprising. And this is the same thing happens, at least that I find, when people, and this is the few miracle claims that I've investigated, is that they make these claims that are really amazing, but then when you get to the evidence is pretty meager on the face of it. It's not the kind of level that you would expect. And this is before trying to even establish any kind of mechanism. So this kind of gets back to this kind of supernatural versus natural, causation. For me, when I hear about UFO claims or alien abductions or faith healings or whatever, the first thing I ask is there anything there? Like, is there just something to even investigate further? And is the level of evidence comparable to the claim that's being made? And these sorts of things that you're doing with the text, to me, don't sway me at all, because they wouldn't sway me in any other modern context. If someone were juggling around words and getting a timeline right, or this person left out this word and casually because and then this other person kind of filled it in, and between the two of them we get a complete story. That to me is just not nearly enough to convince me that someone's cancer was cured because of a certain agent outside of the earth. It's just, they're not the same level of evidence for things.
This isn't a miraculous claim. This is simply a mundane claim that Jesus arrived in Bethany 6 days before Passover, and then the following day he rides into Jerusalem.
Sure.
The only reason I brought that up was because you were contesting my argument on the basis that you think that the gospel authors utilize the Old Testament in causing the correspondence between Jesus' life and the Old Testament sources.
Yeah. I don't see how that addresses it. I mean, so maybe I can ask this question: when do you think the Gospel of John was written?
I'm not sure. I'm non-committal on that. Most scholars would date it to 90 to 95 AD. Some a minority of scholars, like Daniel Wallace, would date it to the 50s AD. And there's some arguments for dating it pre-70, like in John 5 verse 2, it says that there are colonnades by the sheep gate, and these, of course, were destroyed along with the rest of the temple in AD 70 by the Romans. So I'm non-committal on it.
Decades, we'll call it, because that subsumes all of them. And probably the same thing for Mark. Mark's a bit earlier, but again, we're talking 10 or more years. And so we don't have any writings from that kind of middle time, but I think the general assumption is that some kind of oral tradition is what kind of carried these stories between the time of the supposed events and the writing of the Gospels. Do I understand that correctly?
I think that the Gospel authors are close up to the facts, and that there's not a lot of oral tradition separating them from the events.
Yeah, but I'm sure there were some oral traditions that were around going along, and so they could have essentially shared sources, even if they're not written. They could be oral or whatever. This is why, I said that the Passover story is such a great story that you would. It seems perfectly reasonable to me that story would be consistent between the Gospels, even down to the timeline, if it was always told as like the story, right? And just like stories we might tell today, and one author might focus on one little bit and another little bit, but you are using this as a piece of evidence kind of tying real events to the Passover, and I just don't see that. I see it as possibly constructed, which of course, if it was constructed based on Old Testament, then the Old Testament prophecies aren't convincing. So that's kind of the tie in terms of kind of miraculous events.
Yeah, so if any listeners are interested in my interaction with the source theory, which could either be a written source or oral tradition from which both the gospel authors are drawing from, and how that intersects with the argument from undesigned coincidence, I actually wrote a 6-part series responding to Richard Carrier on this very point. But very briefly on this example, and people can find that at answeringmuslims.com. But very briefly on this particular example from John 12, these sources seem to be independent on this point. For instance, John alone tells us that they arrived in Bethany the night before, and it was in the morning that they get the colt. Mark telescopes, so he doesn't mention the fact he arrived in the morning, that they arrived in Bethany the night before, and in the morning he go to get the colt. Also in Mark 13, we're not told that it's actually evening time. It's inferred from the fact that the Mount of Olives is midway between Jerusalem and Bethany, where it's been staying for the night, which adds to the case for this being undesigned. Furthermore, in John chapter 12, we read about Jesus' anointing at Bethany, which happens shortly after Jesus goes to Bethany, and then he's anointed while staying there. Whereas if you look at Mark's account in Mark chapter 14, he tells us that Jesus, or seems to suggest that Jesus is anointed in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper as he was climbing a table 2 days before Passover, not 6 days before Passover. And so there, at that point, you seem to have a discrepancy between John and Mark, suggesting that they're not actually, that these sources are actually independent of one another.
What's independence for you mean? in this case?
John and Mark are not. John is not using Mark as a source on this particular point, and they're not using a common source.
Okay. And how do you distinguish between that and, because I mean, on the one hand, you're saying that they overlap, but when they overlap and they've just dropped out different parts, then that's an undesigned coincidence. But then when they say something different, then that suggests that they're independent. Is that roughly how the argument goes?
Yeah, it's multifaceted. In this particular example, there seems to be a discrepancy between John and Mark as to when exactly Jesus was anointed at Bethany. That's between John 12 and Mark 14. And furthermore, we have to do some inferential work in determining that Mark 13, the Olivet Discourse of Mark 13, is probably in the evening, 3 days before Passover, because it doesn't actually tell us what time of day it is. It's inferred.
I mean, again, it seems like you're using, that they could be using the same sources and possibly modifying a little bit independently, as storytellers will do, right? And so the undesigned coincidences, to me, they may be undesigned in the sense that they have the same source material and they're just dropping out different parts of it, and just focusing on one part versus another one seems to be like a trivial change to a story. The same thing for modifying some various details here and there. To me, these are and the fact that one has to go through and do this detective work shows that the evidence really is not that strong, and certainly not anything that for me anyway, would convince me of anything miraculous or even contribute to that. Every single one of these things seems to me like maybe it's unlikely, but far more likely than a miracle, but being the product of storytelling. And that to me is far more compelling, because we at least know that that's possible and that happens, and we have other examples of it. And so it's unlike the miraculous. So it seems, again, we're dealing with things with pretty moderate, prior probabilities, trying to raise the probability of miraculous events, prophecy, or these sorts of things. Just not particularly convincing. And it surprises me sometimes that people are convinced by the stories, right? And whenever I've heard you speak, and even in this episode, you'll confidently say about the visitations of Jesus and multisensory and things like that, as if like you're just buying the entire story. And there's nothing in the modern case that I could point to that I would have that attitude for. And I'm not sure whether there's anything that you would have that attitude for either. That somehow translating this back 2,000 years, if someone had to go through this kind of detective work for a medical paper in modern times, no one would be convinced by it. And yet it seems like people are convinced by it if you kind of make the case worse by throwing it 2,000 years ago and into anonymous sources, that we have to kind of guess what their authorship is. I mean, none of the authors say who they are. We don't even know who they are.
Yeah, I think we can make a good argument.
Yeah, you can make you can make an argument for it. You have to actually try to infer who it is and who had which copy of what and so on. To me, that did not make a clear case.
Although I mean, the exception would be John, because I think that he does claim. I think that he at least claims to be the beloved disciple.
I think in one phrase that doesn't appear in all the old manuscripts, as far as from what I've read, and so it appears it may be an interpolation. Now, maybe not, but at least it's less clear than that. And he doesn't actually come out and actually say who I am. Even Luke, supposedly the really great historian, never says who he is. And he doesn't say who his sources are. And he doesn't say which ones are good, which sources are good, and which ones are bad, or any of that stuff that you would generally expect for history. Again, we have stories. And coming back, stories don't provide evidence for extreme things. We have stories of faith healings. We have stories of alien abductions. We have stories of UFO sightings. But what we lack are the things that would convince someone in a modern day that these things actually happened that are somehow extreme. I mean, not someone walking into a city, that's not that big of a deal, but like, someone rising from the dead, that, we need a little bit more evidence for that. And I would think that you would as well.
In terms of the gospel authorship, what manuscripts don't have this is a disciple who testifies concerning these things, and this testimony is true.
Again, I heard on I think it was the first time you were on Unbelievable, Justin Brierley mentioned that you have a photographic memory. Is that correct?
in some respects.
Okay, and well, I'm kind of the almost the opposite of that. So it's you look at memory like a sieve, at least on certain things. So so I don't know the exact manuscript. It doesn't have it. I just I recall reading. I think it might have been brought up in a debate with Robert Price, possibly. It might have been in another context where he talked about interpolations. I know he talks a lot about interpolations.
I'm just looking through textual commentaries as we speak, and I can't find any mention of that. Any of the ones
I can always look that up, but again, it certainly is not explicit, and it's only in that one verse, as far as I know, and there does seem to be some debate even amongst Christians as who the beloved disciple is. So to me, I take that to be at least a key.
Although it's someone who was an eyewitness, and John also claims to have been an eyewitness in 1 John chapter 1.
Wait,
right?
John claimed to be an eyewitness in
1 John chapter 1. He says, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was made manifest to us.
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'll have to look at that one.
While you're doing that, Brian, can I just ask a clarification on the when we were talking about the dates for the Gospels, which was it the range of 50 to 90 AD? Are these dates talked about when they were estimated to be originally written, or are those the dates of the earliest copies that we have, and they were possibly created from content that existed before that?
I mean, I'm sure Jonathan can speak better on that, but I'm quite certain our oldest manuscripts are after 100 AD. So it's not the manuscripts themselves; it's what's been kind of inferred. And I think one of the primary ways they're trying to infer it is references to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in 70 AD. So then a lot of that is like, are you to the early part of that or afterward? And I think that's the primary, although there's other possible ways of dating it. Is that correct, Jonathan?
Yeah, and the reason I don't find that argument especially convincing is because it assumes that Jesus couldn't have predicted the future. And if since I think that Jesus could predict the future, I don't find the argument that he predicts the fall of Jerusalem to be especially convincing an argument for putting it post 70. I think the Book of Acts is probably written around in the early 60s AD. And that would therefore place Luke earlier than that, since Acts is the sequel to the Gospel of Luke. And then most scholars think Luke was the last of the synoptic Gospels, which would place him a bit earlier still. And also Luke is quoted in 1 Timothy 5:18 as scripture, for the scripture says, "Do not muzzle the ox which treading at the grain," from Deuteronomy, and "the worker deserves his wages," quoting from the Gospel of Luke. And if 1 Timothy was written in the early 60s AD, as I think it was, then that would place Luke before 1 Timothy by far enough to be considered scripture at the time of Paul's writing to Timothy.
So is this the approximate time of the actual writing, or just the earliest copies that we have access to?
The actual writing. The
actual writing, okay. And would this be by the person named, or is this transcribed from somebody who knew them?
We don't know who the copies were, but the earliest surviving fragments that we have would be, there's a fragment from the Gospel of John called P52, which is a small credit card sized fragment from around 130, although the error bars are quite wide for dating manuscripts. And most of the manuscripts that we have in fragmentary papyri manuscripts are later.
And I think Jonathan, I think your dates tend to be quite a bit earlier than the consensus. Not that I always go with the consensus, but just to kind of draw that distinction. I think the Gospel of Mark is typically placed in the late 60s. Matthew about 10, 15 years later, and then Luke around that same time, probably around 80 or 90. And then the Gospel of John kind of late, like 90 to 110 or something. And then I think Acts is also believed to be around the 80 to 90 AD. And there's obviously disputes about the dates, primarily because the texts themselves don't actually state when they were written or by whom. And all of this is inferred, and perhaps you can make good arguments for it, but it certainly makes the case a lot less clear than it would be, say, for instance, in any kind of modern context. And for any of the events, the sorts of things that I was talking about, for which we're not convinced of miraculous or even extreme sorts of events. So to me, the story is murky enough that there's not really much hope in getting probabilities high enough to overcome the prior probability of overcoming the laws of physics in some way, no matter how you got to read the text. I mean, at best we have the text. And now you had said that there is good kind of extra biblical evidence for things like the existence of God and so on. And I think most of those, if I were to summarize that, would that include basically fine-tuning and design in the universe and things like biological information code and DNA and things like that?
Yeah.
Perhaps the origin of consciousness or origin of life sort of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, okay. So one of the problems there is that, well, I mean, on the fine-tuning argument, I would defer to things like, people like Sean Carroll who know way more about it than I do. But it seems as if all of those cases are at the edges of our understanding and not something that you would expect if the agent that we're talking about is somehow pervasive in the entire universe and able to act on anything on the earth at any time. It seems like it's the sort of thing that if you go back 1,000 years, then the actions of God would include things that now we know are not, or at least are not necessary to be. You have like demon possessions and things like that, which we can now understand this in terms of epilepsy. We have various diseases. Now we understand germ theory, et cetera, right? So the kind of place for God keeps creeping back, and it somehow is telling that the primary evidence that's generally put forward now are all these things at somewhat of the fringes of our understanding and nothing a little bit more tangible. It has the same pattern as other extreme claims. And when you try to look for them, they seem to creep away from that. Like, UFO sightings have gone way down with the advent of video in everyone's pocket. And that's the sort of thing that you would expect when there isn't something there, but people are looking for patterns, looking for agency and other things.
I think that the scientific evidence bearing on the existence of God has increased dramatically over the last several decades, especially since the 1950s, when we discovered that the information in DNA, the chemical subunits that we represent with the letters A, C, T, and G, which along the sugar phosphate backbone of the DNA molecule, essentially function as equivalent to alphabetic characters or an instruction set in a digital code, etc. And information content in every realm of experience is habitually associated with design. And also we know of many cases in the realm of biology of molecular machines and other processes such as embryonic development, which require some sort of foresight in order to bring about. And intelligence is the only cause which is known to possess foresight and that has the ability to visualize a complex endpoint and then bring everything together necessary to realize that endpoint.
Wait, what? That last part I don't think I've heard before. So you said something about some evidence for visualizing an endpoint to a process?
So an example, of course, would be irreducibly complex systems that we find in biology.
I'm not sure whether there are any examples of that have actually convinced biologists. I mean, there's a subset of,
I'm a biologist and I've been convinced. So.
No, I understand that. But what I'm saying is that it is clearly not consensus that these things are irreducibly complex. And that's the sort of thing that I'm talking about is that the sorts of examples are not things that you could convince a reasonable skeptic of.
I see. I'm not so interested in what the consensus is. I'm more interested in what the actual evidence is.
Sure. For example, you said that the code implies a designer, right? And because every other code that we've had, there's been a designer. But I mean, the problem with that argument is that every other code, we actually knew the designer before we saw the code. And so in every other case, there has been a physical designer. We have zero evidence of anything that is beyond the physical designer. We have no examples of minds beyond the physical, and we have no evidence of that sort of agency. And on top of that, I am pretty sure that most biologists are not convinced that this is an example of design. There have been many cases of people thinking something is designed, like the human eye as the iconic example, that has been demonstrated to not require a designer, that unguided processes can produce it. And so I don't see this as being particularly convincing. It is, of course, complicated, and we obviously don't understand all the steps, that's for sure. But I don't think that we have strong evidence for agency in any of this, or even forethought.
Yeah, I've actually written on the subject of the evolution of the eye, and I'm not convinced that it doesn't require design. And I have reviewed the arguments to that effect in the evolution biology literature. On the issue of detecting design, I like to frame it in Bayesian terms. And so the question is, okay, so what's the probability of a genetic code, information content, a decoding system on the hypothesis of design versus what's the probability of that existing on the hypothesis of non-design? And on the former, we know that the information content and digital codes and so forth does arise by virtue of intelligent agents, because we observe them in the informed experience. And we also know the difficulty that blind, unguided, mindless processes have in generating information content. In fact, origin of life models uniformly collapse or fall down at the hurdle of explaining the origins of the first biological information, which is the very point which is associated with design in every realm of experience. And so I think that the probability of that information content and that digital genetic code is much higher on design than on non-design.
I don't think we have any evidence if you have no evidence of any kind of designer, any kind of mechanism, even proposed mechanism for producing it, I think one is kind of essentially at a loss there. Also, if you're saying that we don't understand it yet, it's like, we don't understand it yet, kind of like the origin of consciousness. We don't really understand that yet, and all models are going to fail to some degree. Just like cosmological models are not all perfect, right? There are variables that they can't explain exactly, or some models explain some details more than others. But again, saying that an agent did it is a classic God of the gaps move. And I'm sure you're going to say that you're not making a God of the gaps move, but I'm pretty sure that's what it is. And so I'm not convinced. I mean, basically, we don't know. We don't know the process. I don't think we have even enough information to specify the probabilities for a code developing given non-design, because we don't know the process well. It reminds me of, are you familiar with Newton's description of the solar system?
Mm-hmm.
And he noted, it was known at that time, that all of the planets orbited about the same plane. So even though we're kind of in a three-dimensional space, there's essentially all the planets orbit in kind of a flat disk, essentially. And he realized that his law of gravitation was completely symmetric in 3 dimensions. And so that if you kind of randomly put orbiting planets in a solar system, then there'd be no way to get that sort of alignment. And the only kind of alignment of objects that he knew of was from people, was from design. And so he posited that God was the one who kind of set the solar system in motion in this kind of planar form. And it wasn't for some, decades, 100 years later with Laplace, where he was able to discover a kind of gravitational explanation for the essentially flattening of the solar system over time during its formation. It seems very similar to that, where we have, an observation of something that, seems to be designed. We don't have right now the understanding of whether or not it could have been non-designed, but we're just positing that it's designed simply because it looks designed. And that, to me, is not historically a good argument to make. And one should, cautiously say, wow, this is interesting. This looks designed. I wonder if it could be done by a non-designed process. It might take us a while to figure this out. Until then, we just simply don't know, unless we happen to find what's the mechanism for the designer, right? If you were to demonstrate what mechanism was used to generate the code in the first place from the design, that would be fantastic. Do we have anything like that?
No, but it's not God of the gaps argument, whatever else might be wrong with the argument, because it's an argument from inference. It's based on the standard historical abductive method of inferring to the best explanation from multiple competing hypotheses. And when we find information content and we know of only one category of explanation, one type of cause that's known to explain and produce information content, and we find that very same phenomenon in the world of the cell, it's an abductive inference to design as the best explanation.
How is that different than Hume's inference? Again, the same thing. It was the best explanation, the only thing that would align objects in a plane that should otherwise be in 3 dimensions, is design.
Although one could argue that physical law itself, such as gravity, is a product of design, using a different set of arguments.
Yeah. No, that's not the point. The point was that he looked at something that they didn't completely understand. He understood part of it, and then inferred design because the only examples he'd ever seen were of alignment of objects that should have been essentially random was design. So the best explanation there was design. I mean,
I would dispute the inference there, because there's 3 categories of explanation which can explain anything is explicable ultimately by 3 categories of explanation. One is design, one is chance, and one is necessity, or indeed the combination thereof. Evolution is thought to occur by chance coupled with necessity, which corresponds to law-like regularities. Natural selection, I would say, is a form of necessity.
Sure.
And physical law, like gravity, which explains the planetary motions, is law-like regularity or necessity. And I think it's anything which performs in a law-like, predictable way like that, I think can be explicable by physical necessity. But when it comes to the information content that we find in the cell, what we see there is complex and specified irregularity, which I think is categorically different.
What do you mean by specified?
Conforming to some independently given pattern.
Are you talking about how do you know that it's independently given?
So when we read a paragraph of text, for example, we know that it has a semiotic dimension, meaning that it conveys meaning to people who are acquainted with the language.
Right, exactly. So in the case of DNA, you have the interaction between that and proteins and the environment. I mean, but that doesn't mean that there had to have been some independently specified meaning. I mean, they kind of grew together in that sense. Are you talking about the kind of specified complexity that Epistemic does? Yeah, exactly. and there are like mathematical holes in that. That are, I think there's a pretty straightforward refutation that's even posted on Wikipedia that you could probably find for that one. And I
would like to hear it. I'm familiar with Geoffrey Shallot and Wesley Ellsbury. I've never found their objections to it convincing, but I'm interested to hear your take.
Yeah, I think that's it's a couple of years ago that I read it, but that I'm pretty sure that the idea of specified complexity has not convinced mathematicians in any kind of significant sense. So
there's an inconsistency here, though, because most of the arguments for common ancestry are based on arguments from specified complexity.
In what sense?
So, for instance, take the example of the necessary hierarchical distribution of endogenous retroviral sequences in primate genomes as evidence for common descent. Okay, so the distribution that we actually observe of these retroviral-like sequences in primate genomes is no more improbable than any other random distribution of retroviral sequences. But it conforms to some independently given pattern, namely it forms this nested hierarchical tree-like structure, like a family tree, and therefore we can infer common ancestry as the best explanation.
Yeah, well, I think the idea there is if you have a process that has some structure to it, and then you have I think a lot of the ancestry, I think, is traced, if you can correct me because you're probably closer to this literature than I am, is traced through essentially broken genes. So there's mutations in genes that no longer serve much function, things like vitamin C genes, or, I think the smell genes in dogs and so on, and that you see that they have a function in some animals, and yet there is a process that breaks them, and then they're inherited because they're relatively neutral. They don't have any either positive or negative effect, and so the errors are essentially inherited, and you can develop an inheritance tree from these. And to me, that's very similar to the idea of tracing student collaboration in a way on an exam. You can't go by which answers errors are correct, but if they have the same very weird errors, then you can generally infer some kind of relatedness to them.
But why not just say that the errors are just the product of chance?
Well, because if they were a product of chance, then you wouldn't be able to develop any kind of relationship between them. So like they'd all be independent, and that's not what's observed. So you can think of it as like, okay, we have these genes that have these kind of broken parts to them that are being inherited. We know the process of inheritance, just the way that the DNA reproduces and goes through offspring and populations. And so if there is common descent, then we would expect that the random mutation rate would be a certain amount. It might vary in time, but it would be probably relatively slow and act, you can think of it kind of like a clock. Again, calibrate that clock might be a little tricky, but what if it were completely random, then from one generation to the next, you wouldn't be able to tell that they were any different. But that's not what we see. What we see is kind of almost a progression of these genes, and if you make the tree, it corresponds also to the morphological tree of relatedness that you would do. And obviously there are exceptions, but you get the same sort of pattern. So it's this idea that if you assume common ancestry, you would predict X, Y, and Z, and we can see that the same idea of how Tiktaalik was predicted, right? As an intermediate form, right? If the intermediate form happened, we would expect it at this age. We would expect these certain sorts of features, and then we know kind of where in Greenland we need to go to look for that kind of rock feature to see, and hopefully we'll get lucky, right?
You're absolutely right. You've summarized the basics of phylogenetics quite well. And pseudogenes is another way of inferring common ancestry. And I like the plagiarism example that you gave. How do we know when someone is plagiarizing? Well, it's not merely that the paragraph of text is complex or improbable, but it also matches with this other independently given pattern, namely it matches with this other student's paper or a Wikipedia paragraph or something. And so you would infer that this is the product of design. It's not the product of simply chance.
Well, I mean, the thing that we're talking about here is we know the process for DNA replicates. So in a sense, if we see deviations from that, we expect that to be somewhat random but inherited, and that's the kind of whole process. If we had special creation, for example, there's no reason to expect that sort of thing. Like, why would there be special creation with the same kind of broken genes in the same way? I mean, it just seems really odd.
But you're missing the point. The point is that is a direct parallel to the argument from specified complexity.
I don't think so, because all we have is we have a process that is inherited. It doesn't mean that the code itself was designed externally. It's just the code itself was produced by some non-random process. I'll grant you that. Like there's no way the DNA molecule was produced randomly. All right, but I don't necessarily see that it had to have been designed. That's where we differ.
Yeah, but the point is that the argument that you make for common ancestry is also based on an argument from specified complexity, and you claim that the concept itself is incoherent. And I'm saying no, there's an inconsistency there because your argument is also dependent upon that concept.
I don't see that, and I'd have to go back to the definition. I think my guess is that kind of loosely termed information, we're probably talking about the same thing. I think from what I recall of the critique of specified complexity, it was a little bit more mathematical, and we're kind of using it in a kind of qualitative sense right now in our discussion. So I don't know whether we're really differing at all on that, and the criticism is probably somewhat separate.
Any other direction we want to go before we wrap up?
No, I think I think we've done a pretty good job of exploring a lot of the different things. It's been a fun conversation. Mm-hmm. I have a lot of stuff to look up too.
Yes, thank you both. Dropping to biology took me by surprise. I wasn't expecting, but I think with hindsight, I should have been able to predict that because you both have an interest and experience of biology, and Jonathan, it's your PhD, so I guess I shouldn't really have been overly surprised by that. Thank you very much. I guess one question I wanted to ask, which was kind of where I was going about to rewind about 40 minutes when we're talking about the dates of the Gospels, etc. Just to clarify some of my thinking and where I might be making a mistake is with the dates of the Gospels that are written to, and with my understanding of life expectancies, the people whose names the Gospels and the other letters, possibly including Paul ? These are people who probably would have been dead by before 30 AD. So we're talking a bit of a lag. Okay, this is Matthew interrupting here to clarify what I've just asked. You've no doubt noticed that I've made a mistake in my question. I've confused AD 30 for 30 years after Jesus' death, and the result is that question makes little sense. The question should have been asking how many years after Jesus' death did the eyewitnesses realistically live, and how do those dates compare with the dates that the New Testament books were thought to have been written. Anyway, as you're about to hear, Jonathan catches my mistake and the conversation continues.
Before 30 AD, Jesus died in 30 AD.
Yes, you're right. Sorry, my maths has gone funky. You're absolutely right. So they've been dead by 50 rather than 30. So yeah, I was thinking wrong. Well corrected.
Right.
Yeah, so I find that argument quite a weak one for a number of reasons. One is that the evidence bearing on the dating of the Gospels is notoriously inconclusive. I think that it's best to be non-committal on that. I don't think that any of the arguments for dating the Gospels is conclusive. Secondly, we know that that there were plenty of people we have evidence for who lived to quite old age. For example, Polycarp in the 2nd century famously said when he was standing at his trial about to be burned at the stake, he says, 86 years I have served Christ and he never did me any wrong. How then can I blaspheme a king and savior? So if he lived to 86. Also, Josephus was born in 36 AD, died 100 AD. And also you could even argue that even if that was a good argument, which I'm not convinced that it is, then it would only be an argument because of the lack of conclusive evidence on actually dating the Gospels. You could even say it's an argument for dating the Gospels earlier. And in terms of the actual dating of the Gospel, I think you can make an argument that they're quite early. For instance, I mentioned I date the Book of Acts to early 60s AD, and part of the reason for that is because it ends on a cliffhanger with Paul being placed under house arrest, and there's no mention of the martyrdom of Peter or Paul or James, the Lord's brother, or the persecution under Nero that broke out after the fire in Rome in AD 64, where Nero blamed the Christians for the conflagration. And furthermore, note also the terminological clues. So you've got the sparing use of the noun Christians, the use of martus in the literal sense of witness rather than in the modern sense of martyr. You've got the use of Simon for Peter and the comparatively primitive use of the term ecclesia. And all these internal clues, I think, point to an earlier rather than a later date. And if Acts is written in the early 60s, then that would put the Gospel of Luke earlier still. And it's also quoted from in 1 Timothy 5:18, which would suggest that Luke is probably written in the 50s. And then that would put Matthew and Mark earlier still. As I've said, some scholars, a minority of scholars, even date the Gospel of John, in the case of Daniel Wallace, as early as 50. But you can certainly make an argument for it in the 50s. You can certainly make an argument for John being pre-70 on the basis of, for instance, in John 5:2, where it says, now there are colonnades by the sheep gate, using the present tense, and it seems unlikely we would use the present tense if it were after AD 70. Now, I don't think any of the arguments are conclusive, but it at least shows that you can mount an argument for the Gospels being dated quite early, and so I don't find that argument that you made very convincing.
Yeah, I had a mathematics fail, which obviously worked against where I was going with that. So no, that's fine. Thanks for.
I would also add that if it is inconclusive, and none of the Gospels actually state when they were written, that it does undermine one's confidence in there being eyewitness testimony for the reasons that Matthew brought up. So if John is literally, say, at 100 AD, it is not at all likely that any of the eyewitnesses were alive at that time, right? So if there's and that's basically where the kind of consensus of scholars, places it. But it clearly, if that's even on the map, then it's the sort of thing that should undermine one's confidence, at least. It doesn't make it impossible, but it should undermine the confidence that is eyewitness testimony.
No, because the Gospels, there's good reason to think the Gospels are based on eyewitness testimony, and so they have to have been written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. Beyond that, I think the evidence is inconclusive. I think the evidence is conclusive that they're based on eyewitness testimony. I don't think it's conclusive as to when exactly they were written, besides that they were almost certainly written within the 1st century.
Yeah, I'm not entirely convinced that the evidence is as strong as you state.
Okay.
Thank you. I think I'll call time on that. Thank you so much for that. It genuinely was a pleasure for me to sit back and listen to that. With that said, thank you so much. I'll repeat, it was genuinely lovely to listen to a good, honest and amicable conversation like that. I'm sure I'll learn something when I go back and do the editing and pick up on some of the bits that you guys rushed past. So thank you once again. Have a lovely week, and you'll hear from me in due course.
All right.
Thank you very much, Matthew.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers.
You have been listening to a podcast by Reason Press. To get in touch, email reasonpress@gmail.com or see our website reasonpress.net, where you'll also find our book Still Unbelievable. We welcome more feedback, and you might even end up on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. You can hear more of her music at soundcloud.com/hollybishop. You can support us by buying some of Holly's music and telling her we sent you.